Hello. What do you know about the Oakville history? Perhaps you've gone down below Lakeshore Road down near the lake to see the old town. But today we're going to go somewhere else. We're going to be adventurous and go north of Lakeshore Road. This is where so many of the early settlers built beautiful homes and influenced the growth of the town of Oakville. I have chosen to begin our walk at the Foreman Inn. This was the Foreman Inn that we're looking at now, established in 1834. John Foreman was a farmer and bought this corner lot in 1833 and built an inn on it in the Gothic revival style. He operated it without license. It was the only temperance inn in the town. Over the years, it was operated as a bakery and then a shoemaker's shop. About 1850, Charles Davis took it on and opened it as the Oakville Temperance House, but ran into trouble for serving spirituous liquors. In 1859, it was taken over by Jacob Barnes, run under license as the Halton County Hotel. This building is presently the home of the Trafalgar Lodge retirement home, but it has an interesting past. The south part of the building was put up by Jacob Barnes of the Halton County Hotel, the building we just saw, who made well pumps and stumping machines. In 1869, it became the Excelsior Carriage Works, and in 1870 became the first cabinet shop in the village to use steam power. In 1879, William Carson converted the factory into a planing mill, which he operated for 30 years. Then, an aluminum pots and pans spinning factory operated on the site until it closed in the late 1950s. All this before it became a home for the retired folk who now enjoy life here. John Alexander Chisholm, William Chisholm's second son, purchased this land in 1839. He and his wife Sarah Pettit Bigger lived on a farm north of the town. 3 of his 4 sons became involved in the fruit basket business. His son Charles Pettit Chisholm developed a machine for shaving wood thin enough for fruit baskets. He and his brothers John and William bought the Victoria Brewery in 1874 and converted it into a basket factory. Their great success was the invention of devices to replace the slow and expensive process of harvesting and shelling peas by hand. While attending a canning convention in the USA, John met Robert Scott, and together they worked on a way to separate peas from the pods. The Chisholm brothers perfected the machine, and this large machine, about the size of a boxcar, would be set up in a field to separate the peas from the vines. Their new machine would accomplish in a day the work previously done by over 600 workers. But back to the house. In 1894, the house was built in an L shape. Originally, the veranda bordered the house on 2 sides. It was very ornate, with decorative shingles and geometric designs that include fans, quadrifoils, and sunburst patterns. The ballroom that extends northward from the rear of the structure was added shortly after the house was built and was the scene of many parties, with an orchestra performing from a raised platform in the bay of the room that projects from the north end of the ballroom. It was one of the last great houses built in the 19th century in Old Oakville and was the site of many large Chisholm gatherings until the late 1950s. You will hear me speak of the Chisholms often as we walk, as Oakville was the result of the foresight and planning of William Chisholm, who saw the possibilities of a harbor at the mouth of the 16. Why was a harbor important? The roads in the early 1800s were all but impassable most of the year, and the railway had not yet arrived, so the only way to get folk in and out was by water. William Chisholm was born in 1788, and when he was 6 years old, his family moved to the north shore of Burlington Bay. He received his education there and fought in the War of 1812. Then he got into the business of timber and grain, and that's where the money was. He was able to purchase about 1,000 acres of land for just under $4,000 at the mouth of the 16. This was a great purchase until he realized that the schooners that would be using the port needed 8 feet of water. Luckily, he had been involved in the dredging of the Welland Canal and the Burlington Bay Canal, so he understood dredging. He hired many of the new settlers to help him dredge out the mouth of the 16, build the piers and the ships, and then went about establishing his dreamed-of town. So you will hear a lot of William and his family as we explore the town. The Henry Gullidge House of 1876 is a beauty. James Williamson purchased the lot in 1835 for £50. The east wing was built first, and what is now the main part was added in the 1870s. Upon Williamson's death in 1875, the house sold for $200 to Henry Gullidge, and again changed hands in 1886 for $263, and in 1904 it was $1,000. Julia Isabel Eaton bought the house in 1938 for $3,700. Lady Eaton visited here often and took tea on the veranda while her chauffeur waited in the car. To this day, it is still one of the beautiful homes in Old Oakville. We are now passing George's Square. In 1835, William Chisholm set aside George's Square for public use. It was probably named after William's father, George, but it could have been named after any one of many Georges, including the king. But it has never been called St. George's Square. Upon William's death, the park became the property of William's son, George King Chisholm, who was the mayor. In 1875, it was conveyed to the town for $1, with the condition that the town maintain a fence around to keep the cattle out. The original part of the cenotaph commemorates those who died in the First World War, and the benches are in memory of those who lost in the Second World War. The original fountain was lost over the years, but was discovered by former Mayor Harry Barrett at the water purification plant. It was then installed at its present location. As you stroll through the park later, take note of the many species of trees that were planted here. They are rare in this area. You will have time at the end of the tour to relax and really enjoy this beautiful park. John Wood purchased the property on which this house stands from William Chisholm in 1839. He was a mason and a tavern keeper. Upon his death, it was purchased by John Urquhart, a druggist. He sold it to Robert Farley in 1857 for £50. The value went as high as £300, before in 1867 it plunged to $125. Dr. Charles Lusk and his wife, Jerusha Potter, were the purchasers. After Charles' death, his wife sold the house to Dr. William Wilkinson, who was the medical officer of health and coroner for Trafalgar Township. The house was built in the Gothic pointed style. The red ochre paint with false mortar lines covers the original brick. There have been many additions over the years. The Mccraney family was quite important to the development of Oakville. Moses was the eldest of 10 children born on a farm at the corner of the 4th line and Lakeshore Road. As the eldest son, he inherited the farm in 1852, but provided farms for his 3 brothers and his mother. Her farm is now part of Appleby College. As well as the farm, Moses had a general store and made buying trips to the U.S. with Timothy Eaton. When corsets became popular, he brought 3 back, giving one to his wife, who apparently had a 21-inch waist. I can't imagine. At some point before 1872, he bought this house. There have been many additions to the house, and recently the porch was put back and the main entrance moved back to its original location at the side. This property was purchased from William Chisholm by William Dolby in 1838, and the house was built a year later. In 1846, it was purchased by Melancthon Simpson. Melancthon and his brother John had a shipyard and built schooners which sailed as far afield as South Africa. After moving away from Oakville, Simpson built the steamship Seguin, which is still sailing on Lake Muskoka today. In 1920, the house came back into the Chisholm family, where it remains today. It's a fine example of a Regency cottage, and several additions have been made over the years. John Potter was born in 1811 and arrived in Oakville as a young man to work on the construction of the harbor piers. He became a shipwright and a house builder. Potter was a Temperance man and was instrumental in building the Temperance Hall. He got into financial difficulties and sold the house in 1859. 2 owners later, it burned to the ground. Construction of this house was completed in 1874, and it was rented to the Presbyterians for use as a manse. Potter never lived in it. The last Presbyterian minister to live in it was Dr. Munro, whose grandson owned Munro's books in Victoria, BC. The grandson's ex-wife is author Alice Munro. It's a magnificent home with balconies on the tower. The original latticework veranda has been replaced by a closed-in porch. In 1869, the original house burned to the ground. Mary was determined to rebuild it of stone and spent years collecting stones from the creek bed, which she carried up the bank in her apron. We are unable to see the original stonework as it is covered in stucco. It would be wonderful to see the original stonework. Mary kept animals in her town lot, from 3 to 8 cattle, 2 or 3 sows, and a large flock of geese, which frequented the river, and many chickens. She wasn't careful in keeping them penned up and was frequently fined by Constable Sumner for letting them run at large. Over the years, many repairs and restorations have made it the lovely home that we now are looking at. Captain Francis Brown arrived in Oakville in 1867 and rented a brewery on the bank of the 16. When the brewery closed, he became a shopkeeper and a ship owner. In 1879, Brown was commissioned to sail to Africa, where he was to transport missionaries up the Niger River. The following year, he was hired by the Japanese government to deliver a converted steamship to Japan. He remained in Asia for several years, and during his travels he shipped home many art objects. Upon his return in 1889, he held an exhibit of bronzes, ivory, embroidery, and china here in this very home. The walls of the house are 18 inches thick and support a belvedere way up top. This house is a favorite of mine. Let's take a break from Trafalgar and turn right onto Lawson Street. Robert Wilson and his 2 brothers, William and George, came from Ireland with their mother, who was widowed and brought her 10 children to Oakville in 1817. 1832, Robert built a home on the corner of Navy and King Streets. Then in 1837, he bought this property and built a house on it in 1862. It became known as Mariner's Home because of his custom of bringing ill and homeless sailors to live with him. He is the same Captain Wilson who helped escaped slaves across the lake to freedom as part of the Underground Railway. His granddaughter describes the original house as having its front gate on Dundas Street, as Trafalgar was named at that time, with a flower-bordered path covered by a grape arbor leading to the front of the house. The northwest section of the house was surrounded by orchard, and the northeast by a vegetable garden. There was also room for a cow, a hen house, and a pigsty. It was like a miniature farm. This was all quite necessary, as it housed and fed so many mariners who needed a temporary place to stay. This house sold in the 1890s for $1,700, a large amount for that time. Samuel Lawson and his family were the first to settle so far north of the village proper. Unable to afford both the property and a home, he obtained from William Chisholm the title of a lot, which he was to pay for when he could. He built a 1.5-story house of handmade brick on the property and surrounded it with an apple orchard. The street bordering the property to the north became known as Lawson Street. Now let's go back to Trafalgar Road for a stretch. William was a builder and contractor and built this house a long way back from the street. There is some connection to Pierre Burton, but I haven't discovered any more yet. Frank Meek had purchased the lot in 1915, but it remained vacant until 1921 when construction began. The Meeks lived in the house from 1922 to 1927. Meek was listed on the census as a paint manufacturer. He sold the place in 1927, and he and his wife located to Oshawa, where he became a partner with a fuel merchant. Unfortunately, they were both found dead a couple months later in their bed due to suffocation by illuminating gas. A suitcase had fallen against the gas valve in the basement, opening it and spewing gas fumes throughout the house through the heating pipes. Galbraith was a local carpenter. William George Galbraith built this house. He was the husband of Mary Jane Galbraith and the father of William G. Galbraith, seen here in the picture. Mary Jane is pictured here, standing by her husband's grave in St. Mary's Cemetery. Kerosene Castle was built about 1856 by Richard Shaw Wood, owner of the Oakville oil refinery, which stood across the street. The refinery, the largest in Canada, produced kerosene and coal oil. Wood habitually wore a fur hat even in the summer to show his affluence rather than because of the climate. He liked to be looked at. In 1866, the refinery burned down and burning kerosene floated downstream as far as the harbor. The fire was caused by a defect in the new very large still which had recently been installed. No attempt was made to rebuild. The house was a single-family residence until the mid-1900s, when it was split to become a nursing home, and one side was an apartment building. In 1978, it was transformed into McLaughlin College, a private day school. The building is in the style called Second Empire, which came to Canada from France in the mid to late 1800s. This house is one of two brick houses built side by side by the Blakelock brothers, who were builders in Oakville. The house was built in 1914 and had many tenants, but the most interesting was Meta Smith, who was born in 1891 in Indiana and came to Canada with her sister. She attended nursing school at Kingston General Hospital, graduating in 1915. In 1917, she commissioned into the No. 3 Canadian Army Medical Corps as a nurse. Over 2,800 civilian nurses became the first women in the modern world to hold military commissioners as officers. They were called nursing sisters and were given the nickname Bluebirds because of their blue dresses and white veils. After the First World War, Meta Clem married Roy Foster Smith in 1919, and they purchased their home here on Trafalgar and had 2 children. Roy was an engineer and was involved in the building of the 2 large bridges over 12 and 16-mile creeks on Highway 5 in 1918, and he became Halton's first county engineer. They were both buried in St. Jude's Cemetery. This William was the grandson of the founder of the town. He and his brother Charles bought the Victoria Brewery across the street in 1874. It has been idle for 4 years, and they turned it into a basket-making factory for the strawberry business. Growing strawberries was perfect for the soil, and by 1877 became a huge business. He died in 1889, and the following year, the basket factory was taken over by Ferris, Doughty, and Son. In 1893, the entire factory burned to the ground. Suspicion centered on Robert Mackenzie Chisholm, another Chisholm brother. He had been confined with mental illness but had recently been released. He confessed and was returned to the asylum, where he died soon after. The rebuilt factory burned again in 1919 and was moved to the west side of Trafalgar between Cornwall Road and the railway. The steam whistle could be heard all over town when it called the employees to work, sounded for lunch and for the end of the day, but it was also used to summon volunteer firefighters. The basket factory closed for good and was demolished in 1988, and all that is left now is the steam engine wheel, which was moved to the south side of Cornwall Road at the brow of the hill. The house at 385 Trafalgar is a blend of several styles of Victorian architecture. Take the time to look at all the features on this beautiful home. John A. Chisholm was the third son of William, the founder of Oakville. He originally was a farmer in Nelson Township, now Burlington, until he took possession of the farm, which ran north and east from here. He also ran the family mills. This beautiful home was originally at the end of a long lane, but was moved here and remodeled in the early 1900s. He was also a founding member of the Oakville Temperance Reformation Society in 1834. Alcohol consumption was a very big problem in the 1800s in Oakville. George Burton Nesbitt bought the house in 1949 and lived here with his wife Marion and their 4 children for 15 years. Having only 4 children was a big change from the large families of the 1800s. In 1914, Herbert purchased a small piece of land owned by the Oakville Basket Factory and built his home there. The Ashbury family owned the mill on the river for 27 years, where he and his brother Lorne worked alongside their father. They installed modern machinery, which included the largest overshot wheel in Canada. Trafalgar Road has had several names over the years. It was probably known as 7th Line, although the lower portion of it is not straight because it follows the creek bank and thus became known as River Road. Later it became known as Station Road as it ran to the new railway station. Then it became Dundas Street before becoming Trafalgar Road when Oakville and Trafalgar Township amalgamated in 1962. This change was to avoid confusion with Highway number 5, which was also known as Dundas Street. I wonder what it will be renamed next. It was the main entrance to the town, apart from the harbor. 6th Line runs parallel to Trafalgar and now stops at the QEW, but once continued across the tracks and then curved east to meet Trafalgar Road. At the corner stood a toll gate. This northern area of Oakville was home to many industries: Glasgow Jams, McDermott's Fuel and Ice, Davis and Doughty Lumber and Planing Mill, Oakville Pressed Brick, Langmuir Paint and Varnish, Canadian Tire and Rubber, Oakville Aluminum Company, and Canadian General Tower. They were all located in this area because of the railway's arrival. We think of the GO train service as being the reason so many commute to Toronto or Hamilton on the rails. Not so. Passenger train schedules have been available since 1855. That's the end of our walk today. I think it would be wise if you went across to Georgia Square to relax. It's a wonderful park. It has 22 different kinds of trees, or you can just sit and enjoy the flowers and the peace and quiet. Thank you for coming with me today. It's been a pleasure.
Looking for more great content like this? Why not check out the Oakville Historical Society website, YouTube channel, or Facebook and Instagram pages?